some nature shots instead. So,
what is storytelling? Through my perspective of William Shakespeare's The Tempest, a story within a story, and an exploration of his imprisonment and the imprisonment of others within the intoxicating nature of the imaginary, we witness how he was both creatively restrained and freed by the Jacobean-era society that surrounded him. By exploring these paradigms, in conjunction with an analysis of Hag-Seed and Margaret Atwood's own context, we are provided with a looking glass into the world of layered storytelling and cultural epiphany. Being particularly notable in a postmodernist approach to rewriting The Tempest, a text deeply rooted within the imaginative scope of the Renaissance. The differing representations of characters between these texts allow for this recreation of this story within a story, revealing postmodernist freedoms, whilst bringing us a step closer to understanding what our own narratives truly are. Storytelling itself, as seen through the meta-theatrical structures of The Tempest and Hag-Seed, allows for an exploration of power and imprisonment within their respective narratives, ultimately highlighting that creators, as well as their creations, are bound by the context they inhabit. We can see this in Shakespeare's depiction of Prospero as the playwright, as highlighted when he speaks to Miranda and his backstory about himself as a colonizer, in a sense, and his desire to create new stories for himself free from the restrictions of Milan.
Arrived, and here have I, thy schoolmaster, made thee more profit than other princes can, that have more time for vainer hours, and tutors not so careful.
His use of the language "more profit" in regards to the island indicates that he uses it as he would a tool, however through a colonialist lens, attempts to frame it for Miranda herself, made thee more profit that other princes can. In addition, his statement that he has more time for vainer hours underlines the fact that the two of them are free from societal demands, describing the island as a tabula rasa, a blank slate, in a sense. Combined with his hierarchical descriptions of himself as thy schoolmaster and the aforementioned statements, we as the audience realize that he wishes to build his dukedom to write his story once again. This highlights the Jacobean-era context that enveloped the narrative, revealing our first glimpse of a story within a story that mirrors its own cultural boundaries. Whilst highlighting some post-Renaissance thinking, his story also further underlines Prospero's playwright role as a storyteller, which is then exacerbated by his narrative control.
My high charms work, and these, mine enemies, are all knit up in their distractions. They now are in my power.
Emphasized by his staff book and the island itself working as metaphors for a quill and paper, we realize that Prospero's high charms are extrapolations of Shakespeare's own storytelling abilities, and that his magic is merely the stories he creates through cultural imaginaries. When we analyze The Tempest in this way, knowing that this was his final work, or final statement in a sense, and how it's been shaped by colonial contexts, we realize that Prospero is, simply put, Shakespeare himself, who is asking to be set free from the contextual boundaries that imprison him. As exclaimed in his final line,
"As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free."
With you being the audience, this exclamation from Prospero brings us out of the play whilst revealing to us the meta-commentary that was being said all along. Herein lies the true story within a story of this play, and perhaps all of Shakespeare's works, that not only creations, but creators themselves are imprisoned within cultural imaginaries, and perhaps the narratives they create as well.
Further, after realizing these paradigms, and my analysis of Hag-Seed with storytelling in mind, it was highlighted pretty quickly that this aforementioned story within a story is precisely what Margaret Atwood attempts to convey in her recreation. She does this by literalizing Prospero through Felix, using postmodernist paradigms to display his metaphorical and literal imprisonment via the Tempest itself. Throughout the many characters that surround him, such as Estelle and Eight Hands, being appropriations of Ariel, and Felix's relationship between the two, he praises Estelle for all of the hard work she does for him, "You're such a star," and uses Eight Hands' abilities to enact his revenge. "Exactly what I need," says Felix, "my brave spirit." Here we witness a dissonance between the external and internal story of his life, in a subtle perception of Estelle, and his far more illusory reference to Ariel through Eight Hands. These two sides are further represented as his literal imprisonment, that being his job of storytelling within a prison, and his more ephemeral imprisonment, seen within his quasi-schizophrenic relationship between himself and his deceased daughter.
Through this imagination and wishful thinking, combined with descriptions such as "his Miranda must be released from her glass coffin," we realise Atwood's postmodernist reimagining of storytelling in Hag-Seed, one framed through a layered, part reality and part imaginary imprisonment within cultural perceptions. This is where contextual framework begins to blur with imaginary narrative, however, and we still haven't answered the question raised from my first viewing of The Tempest. What is storytelling? Well, through multiple depictions of Caliban throughout differing contextual reiterations of The Tempest, we witness storytelling grow beyond the play itself, and as it branches into the very cultural and societal paradigms that shape our history, we may find the answer. Firstly, since The Tempest's conception, there have been a wide variety of representations of Caliban. Originally depicted with monstrous, often fish-like qualities.
What have we here? A man or a fish?
His characterization reflected colonial zeitgeist surrounding fears of the unknown and savages outside of society. Moving into the 18th and 19th centuries, his qualities and character were contextually altered to more Darwinist representations, in some cases acting as a missing link between humans and animals. Now, in an era freed from the bounds of colonialist ideals, Caliban has taken a more nuanced, often suppressed characterization, as seen in texts, funnily enough, such as Hag-Seed. However, as seen in more traditional renditions of the play, while moments of poeticism do challenge Jacobean-era beliefs,
"Be not afeard! The isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not."
the comedic and foolish nature of his character ultimately underlines this illusory freedom from contextual prejudices against savages.
Pan, you can't eat pan. That's a new master. Get the new man.
As we will soon witness, however, Hag-Seed reveals a whole new layer to Caliban's story in the original play. The prisoners, who are each direct representations of the imprisoned Caliban seen in The Tempest, are also representations of the contextual depictions of him seen throughout time, ultimately revealing his own story separate from the original narrative itself. Being particularly notable in characters such as Ray Coyote, who has strong beliefs based on their own cultural histories, as he explains that earth and tortoise, both considered sacred to many native Canadian tribes, are used as insults, we witness his cultural roots in native Canadian tribes, mirroring the contextual versions of Caliban seen throughout renditions of The Tempest through a colonially aware lens. Hence, his story within a story seen in the original play through Prospero is adapted into a contextual one through Caliban. As stated by Atwood herself, Caliban has escaped the play. He's escaped Prospero, like a shadow detaching itself from the body. Both depictions of Caliban explored this way ultimately reveal the contextual fabric of the narrative, one that is woven to mirror cultural beliefs and perceptions.
Holy shit, that's meta.
By reflecting on meta-theatrical explorations of storytelling and imprisonment, both The Tempest and Hag-Seed reveal how narrative is shaped by the cultural constraints of their time. Yet through Atwood's recreation, we see not just a mirroring of Shakespeare's constraints, but a personal and structural evolution, especially in Caliban's representation. His transformation across eras, alongside Prospero and Felix's illusory narrative control, reveals that stories aren't fixed, but living reflections of the cultures that shape them. Through this appreciation of Atwood's work, I realized that it isn't the point that context is inescapable, nor does it matter what storytelling actually is, because its inextricable link to the narrative form is exactly what shapes our understanding of what stories are, and not only that, but design new imaginaries that are stories in and of themselves.